Afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to be able to give this talk on sport and exercise psychology at the 50th anniversary, and I appreciate the honor. And I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to do this afternoon, take a little bit different approach, and look at research across 4 decades. So the agenda really is to examine the influence of the pioneers in the sport and exercise psychology area, and their approach to try to make the area more empirical and based on theory. I'm also going to take a look at some of the influence of social cognitive models and social psychological research trends that really started the burgeoning area of sport and exercise psychology. A third area I called the era of expansion in the amount of sports psychology research and the influx of exercise psychology. And then finally, perhaps the last era could be called the era of diversification. At least that's the way I've labeled it, on a wide range of topics. But I'd like to begin with a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that really I was helped a lot by some very noteworthy publications by Veely, by Weiss and Gill, Landers, Gold, and Crane and Whaley in trying to prepare this. Nobody can really cover 40 years without the help of others that have looked on things before. And when I call this a sketch, I really mean it could probably be interpreted as Brawley's reconstructionist history of the things that went on at NASPSPA, or maybe even reconstituted history. So if you want the real stuff, there are a couple of people in the room you could ask, Penny McCullough and Glenn Roberts. So let's begin. In looking at this particular area, the pioneers and their influence tried to make things a little bit more empirical, and as the song goes, long live the pioneers. And here are some of them. There are certainly others, but these are prominently featured in the literature. The Illini triumvirate of Rainer Martins, Dan Landers, and Glenn Roberts. Bill Morgan at Wisconsin certainly was prominent. Dean Ryan, and people that aren't with us today, Dot Harris and Bert Karen. So one of the things that these pioneers tended to do was look at the research that preceded the start of NASPSPA, and they really had a concern about its atheoretical and random kind of nature that was characteristic of that research at the time. And one example concern that they had was one of the things that was going on about the use of personality traits from psychology to profile who might be successful athletes and who might be problem athletes. Ryan called this shotgun research, and a guy called Martins went a little bit further. He challenged the whole idea of predicting success through this particular methodology, and that actually led to an interesting court case, and thank goodness for us, he won. And so in this particular case, that gave further motivation to pursue some of the things that they described as their alternatives, which were social analysis, theory, and some empirical methods. And also in the early years through the 1970s, there was presentations by some of the pioneers and their graduate students. And guess who was one of those trainees, although I looked a little bit different then. And those cute little ladies weren't with me at the time. So in the early years of NASPSPA, we were using social psychology theory applied to sport and physical activity, but still trying to use experimental paradigms. So for example, we were interested in the study of social facilitation, people doing motor tasks or performances at the same time, and we wanted to see how that kind of situation affected task learning and also motor performance. The nature of the research was experimental. It was lab-based. We used novel motor tasks to make sure that we covaried out all the other influences to see whether or not things actually happened. And the models we used to hypothesize were drive theory and the inverted U. But after we conducted all of this careful research, presented some of it at NASPSPA and so forth, people that reflected on it later really found that the effects of this kind of research were small and there were mixed results. So one of the things I think that led to was a reaction of, again, Rainer Martins to what we were doing at that time, and he wrote an article that really talked about trading our smocks in the lab for jocks and moving from the lab to the field-oriented investigation to increase external validity of our work and also try to understand the real world of sport. One of the things that Dan Landers pointed out in some of the work that I read from him is that Martin's never meant that we should exclusively go outside into the lab in terms of research. We still should use lab-related studies, and certainly I think Martin's would agree with him. About the same time, in the 1970s, there was a major phenomenon happening in psychology, and I owe this to Glenn Roberts for making sure that I included this in the presentation. And it turns out that psychology was really interested in person-by-situation interactions, where the person interpreted what was going on in the situation, and that influenced how they thought about things, how they behaved, and how they interpreted their surrounding circumstances. And these cognitive concepts were really viewed as having a mediational influence on motivated behavior. And so what did we see when we were talking about the cognitive revolution? And many of you may recognize a number of these names. In the 70s, all kinds of theories were produced and abounded, and many of them influenced the work that we do today, both in psychology and sports psychology and exercise. Weiner, certainly in the theories of motivation and attribution theory, Ed Deci in intrinsic motivation, Al Bandura, the famous self-efficacy and psychological review, Don Meichenbaum for cognitive behavior modification, and Susan Harder for affectance motivation, and there are others, but that certainly gives you the idea. And remember once again that cognitive concepts in all of these theories were thought to have a mediational influence on motivated behavior and other processes. So this really reflected what one might call a paradigm shift in sport and exercise psychology, where we're moving from what we thought we saw before to something new and something different. And so what we saw in the topics as influenced by these major theories was cognitive cue utilization and arousal attention was studied. Many of the motivational perspectives from those theories are outlined here, and people studied achievement orientation and subjective success. Competitive anxiety was also raised, both a model and a measure, and tested successfully. In youth sport, dropout now started to be examined by psychological factors and psychological perspectives. And again, the pioneers encouraged their first generation and second generation graduate students to present some of the work they did in these areas at the NASPSPA meeting. And we also examined socialization in sport. That became a major influence. What are the family's influences on a child and youth sport, and how does the family and child or youth have a reciprocal interrelationship? Coach-athletes relationships were examined. Smith and Small developed coaching behavior assessment system that fueled all kinds of research that followed and assessed whether or not coaches were actually effective. And so now this brings me to sort of the second generation of people that don't get a whole lot of credit in many of the publications, and that's the women of the organization who really took up the challenge of doing sustained research over a period of time, to this day in fact, on many of the topics that developed in the cognitive revolution. Joan Duda, Deb Feltz, Maureen Weiss, Jean Williams, Penny McCullough, Carol Oglesby, and Diane Gill, to name a few. All right, so now moving to 1978 through 87, we saw a continuing impact of psychology's cognitive revolution and a desire for sports specificity as a couple of the things that were coming out prominently as we morph forward into this decade. But another thing that happened about the right at the start of that particular decade was we introduced a journal called the Journal of Sports Psychology, and Dan Landers was the first editor. So it seemed like we were starting to collect and have a fair bit of knowledge that could be publishable in our own journal going forward. And so what were the topics? I think there was a real trend towards specificity in the sport context, again based on those cognitive revolution models. And people tended to make those theories their own, but also make them sport specific. And so we had people examining sport enjoyment, sport motivation orientations, group cohesion, for example, goals and goal setting, and of course models that had to do with stress and injury. And that greater specificity also caused us to do other things. We got rid of some of the old ideas and measures from psychology and created those of our own with more methodological rigor. Concepts and operational definitions were defined with more rigor so we could make a better relationship and make our questions more salient to the sport audiences we were dealing with. And some examples there in the development are the group environment questionnaire, state trait sport confidence inventory, and the task and ego orientation sport questionnaire, just as a few examples. So this was the beginnings, really, of sustained research that was more specific at that time and moving forward in this decade. But now I think it's probably appropriate to introduce some other, what I would call mini paradigm types of shifts. And this shift really had to do with the emerging interest in the participation of children and youth in physical activity. And I think it's probably everybody knows Mo Weiss is well known for developmental theoretical perspectives, where the key idea here was we were trying to understand the thoughts and emotions and behavior of children in physical activity, but also how they understand their participation in activity. A second emerging interest came from the systematic study of youth sport, and Dan Gould proposed a variety of different questions on how we might do research in this particular area, asking what are the more specific sport complexities of youth sport environments, but also can we gather together some of the knowledge that we learned to apply in practices occurring in youth sport, really a movement much more towards knowledge translation. A second sort of mini paradigm shift was in the area of psychological and physiological processes in sport. And this is where we really had people interested in those processes and inferring how those psychological processes were tied to emotions by focusing on certain kinds of physiological indicators, particularly in the study of attention and performance. And so people measured EEG, heart rate, evoked response potentials, and Dan Landers and Brad Hatfield. I think if Patty Ekakakis is in the room, he was involved in some of this work as well, although later on. And these ideas were really considered important not only for research but application, as you might imagine, in sports that had archery and shooting were key target areas, no pun intended. Now looking at exercise. Exercise psychology started to grow because there was a fitness industry growth in this particular period. And we had emerging interests in exercise, and some of those were examining exercise as a means of reducing anxiety and stress or improving mood and positive emotion. And we also studied exercise in relation to body image disorders and even dependence on exercise to try to combat some of those disorders. We also had some other emerging interests in exercise on motivation. My mind is like, let's go to the gym, but my body's all, dude, chill, this couch is really comfortable. The exercise behavior interventions and motivational factors that govern adherence really became of interest. And again, these ideas were not only considered important for research, but also for well-being and positive lifestyle change. Well, 1988 to 97, we transferred over from the kinds of research and paradigm shifts we saw into more exercise psychology and sports psychology research, and that was reflected in the name change of the Journal of Sports Psychology by adding exercise to the title. And so we're embracing a much broader field. A couple of other things that happened in this particular area was the growth of graduate programs and increasing numbers of submissions by trainees and their mentors to NASPSPA, but also some national level events here in the United States, the report of the U.S. Surgeon General on physical activity and health-related research, and that spurred all kinds of health-related research in physical activity from a variety of different disciplines. We also had burgeoning knowledge, and so we started to take stock of what we know and also what we don't, because we conducted reviews and meta-analyses. We examined measurement procedures that were new and also statistical methods that were important. And many of you can read about those in a pretty timely book written by Joan Duda, as applicable today as when it was written, that had to do with advances in sport and exercise measurement. Other topics in the 1990s had to do with social influence factors, like what was the influence of role models or peer influences. And we continued sport research in a variety of areas, but started to get into other topics. For example, not just focusing on group cohesion, but also looking at other ideas on teams like role clarity and collective efficacy and how they had an impact in explaining both performance and how people thought about their teams. Self-handicapping was also examined at that particular time, where people actually tried to self-handicap so they could manage their notions about their own self-esteem in case they lost, for example, or in case they were in some other kind of deleterious situation. And youth development in sport flourished. Many topics there: parental influence, emotional experiences, and moral development. And if you can find the Brawley kid in that photo, I'll buy you a drink. And we had continuing exercise research. But the continuing exercise research also involved us testing certain kinds of theoretical models, particularly the theory of planned behavior and self-efficacy theory, to see if we could forecast people's physical activity over time and how they responded to different kinds of interventions. We also focused more on health-related quality of life as a function of being involved in exercise for a variety of different age groups. And we also tended to take a look at exercise from more of a public health flavor. The various kinds of questions that were asked at NASPSPA took on some of that kind of flavor as well. And even exercise psychologists got interested in this, or psychologists got interested in this area. Peter Saraganian actually initiated a work in Montreal where a number of psychologists published chapters, but a number of people in this room actually contributed to this edited book. Finally, this last notion in the area of diversification that I talked about, what happened with that? Well, we continued to take a look at a number of the same things, but in this particular case, we were interested in things like the eating behaviors of athletes when they were under stress and how they managed to cope with stress and these additional problems that were in their lives. And we also took a look at a variety of other things and continuing topics in sports psychology, as you can see there. But in exercise psychology, we started to branch out into examining different populations: older adults, various clinical populations, disabilities and body image, proxy efficacy, those individuals who help us train people, so exercise trainers or exercise therapists in cardiac rehabilitation, and what kinds of positive or negative effects they have on people's adherence to physical activity. And finally, how we self-regulate our own behavior to maintain our exercise identities if we have them. Public health interest abounded, and certainly we had other outcomes we began to study in a more serious aspect, that of cognitive performance. What kinds of things does exercise do to cognition and cognitive performance? And what kinds of things does exercise do to improving confidence and not just being active, but also physical function? So, in the 90s, we also saw some of this diversification in alternative perspectives, feminist perspectives on how gender is constructed. And in fact, Carolyn Sheriff in 1979 actually suggested that gender could be, in this particular case, a dependent variable rather than a moderator variable, the way it's always studied. I happen to have a personal interest in that, and good old Carolyn was a mentor of mine. We also examined social ecological perspectives, where we were looking at not only the influence of the individual, but the influence of the urban environment, the walkability of neighborhoods and so forth, to be able to look at broader interests and perspectives on influencing physical activity. And some people were interested in individual change within subjects kind of perspectives because they really felt that we were losing out some valuable information if we just did between group comparisons. And so these alternative perspectives were a healthy sign in the late 1990s and to 2006. But there was all kinds of diversification also in methods, qualitative analyses, in groups, multi-level analyses, and growth trajectories to try to follow people's, like older adults, and their physical activity as they aged, and a wide range of populations and so forth, examined both asymptomatic and symptomatic. So through 40 years, in 30 minutes, we've seen major increases in topical breadth and depth, and a huge growth in the number of scholars and their trainees that come to NASPA and present their work. It's interesting, I borrowed this from Veely's little treatise because one of the things she did was compared Reiner's little 1975 5x6 greenback book and compared it to Weinberg and Gold's book, 5 ounces versus 5 pounds. Either we have a lot more research going on, or the print was quite different. And finally, lots of international journals are a reflection on the type of breadth and work that we tried to present. Okay, so that's a quick snapshot of 40-some years. What about some reflections? And here, I'm taking my life into my hands once again because people might disagree with me, but I'm not going to do too many, basically because we don't have much time. In 1967 to 2006, I think the question to ask is, do these previous decades reflect systematically developed knowledge? And I think it would be fair to say, because of the efforts of many people, the answer to that question is yes. But also, does it reflect an eccentric growth or a refreshing picture of the exercise and sports psychology to come? And I think the answer, again, would be yes to both kinds of perspectives. But I think we've reached a time in our development, and certainly this will be addressed in the Janus Symposium, I believe, where we really have to rethink and be constructively critical in our work. It's not that we haven't before, but now I think we have to do so that much more. So a couple of examples, let me outline what those are. First of all, theories have a lot of practicality. A guy called Brawley actually wrote something about that in 1993. Whether or not you pay attention to him, I think that has meaning for both research and future application and knowledge translation. Another example that we've heard a lot about in the intervention area and physical activity is theory-based interventions are more effective. But I think it's telling, when a lot of people believe that, to take a look at some people in another area and how they examined how we think about and possibly use theory. So Painter and colleagues published a paper in the Annals of Behavioral Medicine in 2008 that was quite interesting. They took 10 journals in the fields of health, medicine, and psychology and had about 193 health behavior published articles that they assessed. Only 36% of those mentioned theory. And of those, only 68% argued the research was informed by theory. And if we look at the bottom numbers, even smaller percentages actually applied and tested theory or tried to do something new and novel. So my question to us is, do we really use theories to predict and cause change in a systematic way, or is our research more or less like the health behavior research? I don't have an answer to that question, but it might be an interesting exercise for a PhD student. I think it's important for us to think things through and take a page from Albert Einstein, who argued we can't solve our problems with the same thinking as when we created them. We've grown a lot, now we have to take a step back and perhaps think about those ideas again. So let me try to illustrate thinking and being constructively critical work, and I'll try to take some of my own examples. In this case, does group cohesion really cause better performance? Well, there are quite a number of reviews that say there's a strong relationship between high cohesion and effective performance in sports teams. But my question is whether cohesion is simply a marker for something. And that marker might be the interaction processes that go in groups that actually cause the performance. Why aren't we measuring and examining and assessing those? as opposed to continuing to examine group cohesion. Not that that's a bad thing. Also, in exercise psychology, we see people correlating self-regulatory efficacy with estimates of movement and energy expenditure. Not surprising, but why aren't we correlating that same efficacy with the measures of actions that lead to exercise frequency? Measures we created and how we created them are a couple of other points that I'd like to take a look at. And I think there are lots of barriers to our efficacious use of the measures we've developed than those of others. So once again, I'll take a page from group cohesion. In the group environment questionnaire, it has 4 scales, 2 of which happen to be social scales. But generally, they're sort of the weak students of the bunch. They don't show a lot of variance in various kinds of studies about group cohesion. But is that because they're not great scales, or there's not much social cohesion, or is that because we don't examine the circumstances under which social cohesion actually evolves? We need to ask those kinds of questions. And of course, in exercise, I think there's unthinking use, in my opinion, of accelerometry as the gold standard of behavior. One of the things that I think people would be interested in, I encourage everybody that's interested in using accelerometry to read this paper by Schrack and colleagues in the Journal of Gerontology that has to do with the complexity of trying to measure physical activity with older adults. It isn't easy, and there's a lot of variability. So what do I suggest in knowledge generation of the future? 3 simple points. There could be others. As many of you know me, I could talk for hours on this stuff. But I think we need to think things through all the way from the basic research question and carry that basic research question forward to knowledge translation, really trying to think things through. And then, and only then, wisely select the theories, measures, and methods that we're interested in. And last, something I would argue is interpret accurately. Many of our journal editors say, well, what are the practical implications? And that causes us to write a lot of stuff. I'd say avoid writing the next self-help book in the implication. Thanks.